The destruction of the city of Jericho, and we had the incident with Achan, who holds back things that are devoted to destruction. And I tried to make the point that, it's important to kind of see the deeper meaning of the narratives of the Old Testament. And one of the things that we're getting in Achan, and he's certainly not the first or the last time we'll see this, but Achan represents a kind of a spiritual blindness. A spiritual blindness that manifests itself in, I'm going to do what I want to do as opposed to doing what I know God has told us we're supposed to do. So we see a huge example of spiritual blindness in Achan and the consequences of that. Well, now we're going to go on and talk about the attack and conquest of the city of Ai. A couple of important things are going to happen in that conquest. And then right at the end of chapter 8, we're going to see the renewal of the covenant, which I want to focus some time on because I think it's a central part of the Joshua narrative. So here's a brief, compressed account of what happens with the next sort of city that they move on to, the city of Ai. I'll read part of it and then also summarize part of it as well. So the narrative begins in Joshua 8:1. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear and do not be dismayed. Take all the fighting men with you and arise and go to Ai. See, I have given it into your hand, and the king of Ai and his people and his city and his land. And you shall do to it you shall do to it and its king as you did to Jericho, and its king, and its spoil and its livestock you shall take as plunder for yourselves. Lay an ambush against the city." So here's the plan now. So Joshua and all the fighting men arose to go up to Ai, and Joshua chose 30,000 mighty men of valor and sent them out by night. And he commanded them, "Behold, you shall lie in ambush against the city behind it. Do not go very far from the city, but all of you remain ready. And I and the people who are with me will approach the city. And when they come out against us, just as before, we shall flee before them. And they shall come out after us until we have drawn them away from the city. For they will say, 'They are fleeing from us, just as before,' so that we will flee before them. Then you shall rise up from the ambush and seize the city, for the Lord your God has given it into your hand." So here's the kind of the plan, and it's really important to kind of notice and pay attention to the instructions. So before anything happens, as we've seen before, God tells Joshua ahead of time what the result's going to be. Don't be afraid or dismayed, because I've already given the city into your hand. That is, the victory here is not questionable. But, and here's an equally important point, right? While the victory is assured, it's not the case that what Israel does simply doesn't matter. Right? It's not, I've given the city in your hand. All you need to do is kind of like walk up to the city, raise a sword, loud shout, and everybody will surrender, and the battle will be over in 5 minutes, and we'll all go home happy. That's not it. So what we see here, right, is, and I think this is the important part, it's not that what the people of Israel doesn't matter. It's that they need to act in symphony with God. Okay? Their action does matter, but it needs to be in accordance with God's purposes. And that's what's really important. And of course, this will be a really important lesson as the life of the history of the people go on, right? God's called the people to a mission, which we've looked at again and again and again, right? We saw it with the calling of Abraham. "In you and all your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed." We saw it in the 19th chapter of the book of Exodus. I'm calling you to be a kingdom of priests and a royal nation so that my purposes may be fulfilled through you. So what the people of Israel does actually does matter. It needs to be done, however, in accordance with the purposes of God. So the two things need to work together. And so what's going to happen here is that part of the army advances on the city of Ai. When the city of Ai fires back, they kind of retreat, and the army of Ai says, they're retreating, they're afraid of us, let's go out after them. And so once all the army leaves the city, then the ambush force from Israel then attacks the undefended city and then takes it. And that's what happens. Now, there are a couple things about how this unfolds that we just want to notice. And one of those things occurs in Joshua 8:18. So the battle's going on now. Then the Lord said to Joshua, stretch out the javelin that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand. And Joshua stretched out the javelin that was in his hand toward the city. And when the men in the ambush rose quickly out of their place, and as soon as he had stretched out his hand, they ran and entered the city and captured it, and they hurried to set the city on fire. So when the men of Ai looked back, and behold, the smoke of the city went up to heaven, and they had no power to flee this way or to that, for the people who fled to the wilderness turned back against the pursuers. Now, the reason why we want to kind of mention this is because one of the things that happens in Joshua is there's a constant sort of noticing of parallels between Moses and Joshua, and we have one of them here. So you may remember back in Exodus 17, the Israelites were in a battle with the Amalekites. And the idea was that as long as Moses kept his arms raised, the Israelites would win. Of course, Moses' arms got tired, so they had to have someone come and hold up each arm to make sure that they got the victory. Here, it's the case of Joshua holding up the javelin. Okay. Now, I think this is a really important thing, because I think sometimes, in our minds, we kind of envision Joshua as sort of like a little Moses, not really like a real Moses, but kind of like, Moses' executive assistant or something like that. Yeah, Moses light. That's not how Joshua presents him. Joshua presents Joshua as a genuine and legitimate successor of Moses, who is important in his own right, because God is doing through him similar things that he did through Moses. So Joshua isn't sort of like a step down figure, okay? Joshua is a leader provided to the people of Israel by God to accomplish his purposes. And we'll see that all the way through the narrative. Now, it's also interesting to see how this story ends. And this is kind of the ending here in Joshua 8:25 and following, the report about what happened and then the aftermath. And all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. But Joshua did not draw back his hand, with which he stretched out the javelin, until he had devoted all the inhabitants of Ai to destruction. Only the livestock and the spoil of the city Israel took as their plunder, according to the word of the Lord that he commanded Joshua. And Joshua burned Ai and made it forever a heap of ruins, as it is to this day. And he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening. And at sunset, Joshua commanded that they took his body down from the tree and threw it at the entrance of the gate of the city, and raised over it a heap of stones that stands there to this day. So I want to say a few words about that. Now, remember, we saw with the city of Jericho, we're seeing it with Ai, that at one level, right, one of the things that's going on with the destruction of these Canaanite cities is God's judgment. Not just on these cities as cities, but God's judgment on the whole Canaanite order of things, okay? In the mind of Joshua here, the Canaanite city-states represent, you might want to think of each of these city-states as being sort of smaller versions of the city of Babel. They represent a kind of sinful human order of things which goes against the grain of creation, okay? And so the destruction of the cities represents God's judgment on these. And you can see this, I think, in a very dramatic way in the way that the story ends. So The city of Ai is burned down. We're told that it remains a ruin to this day. And, this is really important, the king of Ai is killed. That is, in effect, right, the supreme leader of this great and powerful city is killed, and his body is hung on a tree. Now that's significant because you may remember that when we were walking through Deuteronomy, remember in Deuteronomy 21, if you hung somebody's body on a tree while executing them or after executing them, this was sort of like the ultimate mark of shame. And so the king of Ai now here is in effect like reduced from being a kind of a demigod to being an obviously defeated figure, right? This is another sign that the Canaanite order, as powerful, as wealthy, as influential, as invincible as it may appear, is just simply another sinful human order that's being overthrown. But there's something else here that we want to note, and that's we have a kind of a little in here to something that Paul says in his letter to the Galatians. This has to do with someone being hung on a tree. So Paul is coming back and he's referring back to that passage in Deuteronomy 21. It's Galatians 3:13-14. So I just want to say a word about that. Here's what Paul says in Galatians 13-14. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. That's the quote from Deuteronomy 21. So it is that in Christ the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. So notice what's going on here. In Deuteronomy 21, right, we read about this practice of someone being hung on a tree as sort of like the ultimate sign of disgrace. Okay? Paul then comes back in Galatians 3 and uses that as a way of interpreting the cross. Jesus too was hung on a tree, right? A sign of disgrace, a sign of rejection. That's part of what crucifixion was for, right? It wasn't just to kill people, it was to shame them in public, right? While your clothes were removed, you were nailed or strapped to this cross in full public view, and everyone was able to kind of stand down there and gawk and gape while you slowly died. And so Paul's point right here is that Jesus died that kind of like awful, shameful death. The purpose of it being, right, to take the shame that was properly ours through sin and literally to sort of like absorb it into himself, relieving us from it, okay? So this kind of shameful method of death actually becomes a method of redemption. And now we kind of see them as bookends, right? The hanging of the king of Ai on this tree is the sign of shame. The hanging of Jesus on the cross is a sign of shame redeemed. So they kind of serve as sort of theological or spiritual bookends. So I think that's a really important point. And then, after that, something really important happens. In Joshua 8:30 and following, they renew the covenant. So I want to say a few words about this because this, I think, is a really important moment. At that time, Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, on Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the people of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law, that is probably the book of Deuteronomy, an altar of uncut stones upon which no man has wielded an iron tool. And they offered on it burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. And there, in the presence of the people of Israel, he wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written. And all Israel, sojourner as well as native born, with their elders and officers and their judges, stood on opposite sides of the ark before the Levitical priests, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, half of them in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of God, had commanded at the first to bless the people of Israel. And afterward, he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, and the women and the little ones and the sojourners who lived among them. So notice what's going on here. This moment kind of is very similar to what we saw back in Exodus 24. Remember where we find the sealing of the covenant on Mount Sinai. This is sort of a Sinai moment, and it's really important to see it that way, right? Because one of the things that's going to happen periodically is that the covenant is going to have to be renewed. And the purpose of this renewing, I think, is really important in a number of dimensions. So let's see, first of all, what happens and then kind of its significance. So the people of Israel gather here between these two mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. In the very center is the Ark of the Covenant, and you've got Levitical priests on one side and Levitical priests on the other, and then you have the people of Israel kind of gathered around this throne of God, the heavenly representation of God, the earthly representation of God's heavenly throne. And then two important things happen. First, we have the offering of burnt offerings, and then we have the offering of peace offerings. And remember, back when we were on our journey through the book of Leviticus, right, we discussed both those offerings briefly, right? Burnt offerings were signs of Israel's complete devotion to God, right? Because you took the thing that was offered, the ox or the lamb or whatever it was, and the whole thing was completely combusted on the altar of burnt offering. And so the idea right there is that the complete offering of the animal, in effect, is the visible representation of Israel's complete offering of herself to God. And then we have the peace offering. Remember, that's the offering where part of the animal is burnt on the altar, part of it's cooked and then eaten as what we would now call kind of like a Thanksgiving dinner. The idea being, right, that the meal, in effect, becomes a visible sign of the relationship between God and his people, right? You've just eaten something that was offered to God, and now that thing now becomes the visible bond between you and God. So notice what we have going on here. Part of the covenant involves this offering, a burnt offering, total dedication. Part of it involves peace offering, that is the visible communion between God and his people. And then the second thing that happens is Joshua stands up and he reads the whole book of the law in the hearing of the people of Israel. Probably what's envisioned here is Exodus 20 to 23. That's called the book of the covenant. But it's read, and I think what we probably need to think about going on here is not just sort of Joshua like reading something and the people of Israel going, yeah, we've heard that before, okay, yep, sounds good to me, yep, where do we sign? I think that what we actually need to think about here, right, is we need to think of the reading of the book of the law almost along the lines of a kind of a wedding vow, right? Do you take this woman to be your wife, to have and to fold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, and in sickness and in health, till you are parted by death? I do. That's what's going on here, right? This, in effect, right, this isn't just Joshua like reading something. This is, in effect, Israel assenting to her vow of loyalty to God in the book of the covenant. So this is what the renewal of the covenant means, right? It's these sacrifices, the hearing of the book of the law read, and the people then assenting to it. Notice the account makes it clear that that Joshua reads all of this. He doesn't leave any of it out. And this is important too, everyone is there. Men, women, children, and even people who are actually not part of Israel, sojourners. They all hear this, and they all assent to what is read in the book of the law, and that then kind of renews the covenant. Now, why is this important? Well, I think it's important in a couple of ways. One of the dangers, I think, that we often run today is we often run the danger of thinking about the people of Israel in the Old Testament as basically being exactly like the modern state of Israel today. And they're actually quite different. And that's because in the Old Testament, the people of Israel are not defined by simply occupying a sort of a geographical space or having a certain form of government. Rather, the defining mark of what makes Israel Israel is her covenant with God. That's the thing that makes these people the people of God. Everything else is sort of part of that. But if the covenant's broken, all those things can be taken away. That's, of course, what happens with the Babylon exile, right? No land, no king, it's all gone, no temple. So it's not just that this is sort of like an interesting ritual. This is actually the thing that makes the people of Israel the people of Israel. This is, in effect, their like constitution, if you want to think about it. I mean, that way. So it's really, really important. One other thing that we might want to note here in terms of kind of thinking about what's going on before going on, or at least trying to get into chapter 9. We also have another theme, I think, that's really important that we're being told about here. And that is that, as we've seen in the book of Deuteronomy, one of the dangers that constantly faces God's people over and over and over again, and Achan is sort of like a little, a little flashing warning light about this. One of the dangers that God's people face over and over again is that they're constantly in danger of forgetting who they are and why they're here. Right? We'll see this when we get into chapter 9. But that's one of the reasons why we have, or one of the many reasons why we have the renewal of the covenant here, echoing the renewal of the making of the covenant on Mount Sinai. Case in point now, Joshua 9. Here we have the people of Israel are taken in by the Gibeonites. This is both a sad and also a humorous story, so I'll summarize it and then make 1 or 2 points about it, and then we'll stop for today. So here's what happens at the beginning of Joshua 9. As soon as all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and the lowland all along the coast of the Great Sea, and Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, heard of this, it is the fall of Ai. They gathered together as one might fight against Joshua and Israel. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they, on their part, acted with cunning and went and made ready provisions and took worn-out sacks for their donkeys and wineskins and worn out and torn and mended with worn-out patches and sandals on their feet and worn-out clothes and all their provisions that were dry and crumbly. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal. So here's what happens. 2 different reactions to the fall of Ai. One is, for some of the Canaanite city-states, they hear what's happening and they say, okay, we're in danger. It's time to nip this in the bud. We need to get together and we need to take action against these people because look what they've done. So, okay, it's time for war. The Gibeonites, who are in the land of Canaan, take another path. And this is interesting. Although they're fairly near the people of Israel, what they do is they come to the people of Israel, but they come with kind of like worn out clothes, and they put dust all over themselves, and they put worn out shoes, and their bread supply is filled with dry, kind of musty, coldly bread. And so they kind of come into the camp at Gilgal. Well, we're the Gibeonites, and we've traveled a long, long, long way to come make a covenant with you. Joshua, of course, they haven't come a long way at all. They've come 5-6 miles, but this is a deception. And so what they ended up doing is they end up making a covenant with the people of Israel so that they're not destroyed. Now, there's a problem with this, and the problem is noted in Joshua 9:14. It's a small problem, but it's a problem nevertheless. So the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. They make a covenant with the Gibeonites based simply on what they've been able to observe and find out on their own. They don't inquire of the Lord. And of course, they seem to conveniently have forgotten that they're not supposed to make a covenant with any of the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. Okay? Now, I think there's a really important lesson here. The people of Israel here act in terms of like their own thinking, right? The people of Israel see themselves as acting basically in accordance with sort of like, pragmatism and the principles of evidence. Okay? These people come to us. They say they're from far away. They want to covenant with us. That's going to make life easier for us. We check them out, and yeah, sure enough, gosh, all their animals look tired. All their clothes are worn. Their shoes are worn out. Their bread supply is dwindling, and it consists of, moldy crusts of bread. They've clearly come from a long, long way. Let's have mercy on them. Makes sense to us. Let's move forward. But of course, not having consulted the Lord, they're simply acting on their own understanding. And they act unfaithfully. Important point, they don't set out to act unfaithfully, but they do. Okay? They don't say, here's a chance, here's another opportunity to disobey God. Let's take it. They kind of examine things and, the story seems to check out. And so they say, hey, we got a lot of people to fight. Here's a group of people that are willing to make peace. It sounds good to us. Let's go with it. So we have a huge problem with the Gibeonites. The deception eventually is found out. And so something interesting happens, and I think it's worth pointing out what does happen. Joshua decides, to his credit, that having made a covenant with the Gibeonites, he can't break it. Although the people of Israel kind of are angry, and here's another little interesting piece, right? The people of Israel become angry with Joshua for not fighting a war with the Gibeonites after having made a covenant with them. And once again, they could have they sort of like go back into their, what I call their Exodus routine. Remember when they were out in the wilderness and there was no food or water, and they all said, "This is an awful situation, Moses. What have you done to us?" They kind of do a similar thing with Joshua. They kind of make it seem as if Joshua, on his own, made a covenant with the Gibeonites, and they were just sort of like along for the ride when they went along with themselves. So now they're all upset, and there's kind of a big fuss about that, and they complain to Joshua. Here's part of what happens. Joshua summoned them, and he said to them, "Why did you deceive us, saying we are very far from you, when you dwell among us? Now therefore you are cursed, and some of you shall never be anything but servants, cutters of wood, and drawers of water for the house of my God." And they answered Joshua, "Because it was told your servants for a certainty that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. So we feared greatly for our lives because of you and this thing." This is what the Gibeonites tell him. Joshua says, "Well, why did you lie to us?" And the Gibeonites said, in effect, "Well, duh, because we heard that the Lord your God told you to wipe us all out. That's why. So we kind of finagled this covenant with you." What happens, and this is interesting, what happens is that the Gibeonites, in effect, become sort of like what you might call employees for the tabernacle. So from henceforth, the Gibeonites now become, in effect, folks who are sort of like are tasked with the maintenance of the need for the tabernacle, getting wood for fire, drawing water for washing, for sacrifice. And so they kind of, notice this, the price of their deception becomes they now have to kind of maintain the tabernacle in Israel's worship of God, which is kind of an interesting sort of thing. Yeah, Ben? There kind of is, yeah. We see them kind of recognizing, right? These are Gentiles who recognize what the God of Israel is doing and then try to find some way of kind of getting spared in that process. Yeah, very much so. There's very much a parallel. Now, that gets us into Joshua 10, so we'll save that for next Sunday. But I just want to kind of give you a little bit of a preview here. The kings of the Canaanite city-states obviously are not sort of like taking all this lying down. And so in Joshua 10, the kings of the Canaanite city-states say, okay, the Gibeonites have made a covenant with the people of Israel. We're going to take revenge on them first, and then we'll deal with the people of Israel. We're mighty city-states. We've got professional armies. We've got armor. We've got the latest military equipment. We are going to, like, crush them. So let's get out there and crush them. As you might expect, that's not what happens. What does happen is really important, and we'll take a look at how that struggle ends up next Sunday.